In Book 8, the Phaeacians entertain their mysterious guest. The day after Odysseus' arrival, Athena goes in disguise to each of the men of the city, encouraging their curiosity about the stranger. At a city assembly, Alcinous lays out the plan for the next few days. Preparations will be made for the guest's voyage home, but in the meantime, he will be lavishly entertained. At the feast, the poet Demodocus sings of the Trojan War, especially about a quarrel between the warriors Odysseus and Achilles. Odysseus, remembering the many griefs of the war, begins to weep. Alcinous glosses over the moment by suggesting that everyone go outside for some athletic contests. Odysseus at first refuses to join in, but when the younger men suggest that he is old and out of shape, his pride is hurt, and he successfully competes. Demodocus then sings the famous story of how Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, caught his wife Aphrodite, the goddess of love, in adultery with Ares, the god of war. He did this by forging a special net to trap the lovers and then pretending to go away on a journey. When Aphrodite and Ares were snared in the net, Hephaestus invited the other gods in to look at them, and the gods all laughed. After the story, there are further entertainments, and Odysseus is given many gifts. Nausicaa offers him a wistful farewell, to which he graciously responds. He then asks Demodocus to sing the story of the Trojan horse, a personal triumph of his own. But reminded of how many Greeks didn't survive the war, the exiled king begins to weep again. Odysseus' hosts still do not know who he is. It would be rude for them to ask too soon, but Alcinous is beginning to guess, especially since Odysseus' arrival at his island has been prophesied. The king asks his guest to share his story. Throughout the Odyssey, we find great emphasis placed on the importance of asking people for their stories. Athena makes sure that the Phaeacians want to hear Odysseus' story. Odysseus may be a great hero, he may have done great deeds and survived great adventures, but all of that will be lost to memory if his story is not told. Here again, the tradition is commenting on itself. The poet, too, must tell the story, and the audience must hear it, so that the tradition can live on. Like the other poets of the Odyssey, the Phaeacian poet Demodocus is divinely inspired and treated with great respect. And like many poets in Greek tradition, Demodocus is blind. There was a belief in the ancient world that Homer himself was blind. There are many cultures in which blind people become musicians or singers, because those are professions that do not require the practitioner to be able to see. Also, in poetic traditions such as that of ancient Greece, where poets are believed to be divinely inspired, the blind are often thought to have a special sort of vision that comes from sacred sources. But there is also a practical side to the life of a poet. Homer demonstrates to his audience how a poet ought to be treated by having Odysseus give Demodocus a choice cut of meat, and even adds that poets should be cherished and respected. There are many poets mentioned in the Odyssey, although none of these singers and poets are major characters. Like the heroic figure he is, Odysseus is good at everything. Not only a great warrior, a wise leader, and a fine speaker, but also an athlete. He is also very human, though, capable of being spurred to action by a small dig at his pride. During the contests, he boasts of his ability as an archer to kill his enemy. This foreshadows his attack on the suitors at the end of the epic. Question 1. Who in disguise encourages the curiosity of the Phaeacian men about the stranger? King Alcinous, Ares, Princess Nausicaa, Athena. Athena goes in disguise to each of the men of the city, encouraging their curiosity about the stranger. Question 2. The poet Demodocus sings of the Trojan War, especially about a quarrel between the warriors Odysseus and Achilles. Odysseus, remembering the many griefs of the war, strikes Demodocus to the floor, implores King Alcinous to silence the poet, begins to weep, storms out of the feast. The poet Demodocus sings of the Trojan War, especially about a quarrel between the warriors Odysseus and Achilles. Odysseus, remembering the many griefs of the war, begins to weep. Question 3. Like the other poets of the Odyssey, the Phaeacian poet Demodocus is treated like a fool, actually a god in disguise, divinely inspired and treated with respect, not to be trusted. Like the other poets of the Odyssey, the Phaeacian poet Demodocus is divinely inspired and treated with great respect. So far, the stories of Telemachus and Odysseus have taken place more or less simultaneously and in present time. Now we have a flashback, as Odysseus tells of the adventures that led him from the walls of Troy to Calypso's island. In Book 9, he visits the land of the Lotus Eaters and the Cyclopes. The stranger identifies himself to the Phaeacians as the famous hero Odysseus of Ithaca. He tells them how he and his 12 ships left Ilium, another name for Troy. First, they sack a city, but take too long getting away and are almost killed by the kinsmen of the inhabitants. Then a storm drives them off course to the land of the Lotus Eaters. Any of Odysseus's men who eat the sweet-smelling fruit of the lotus forget everything, wanting only to remain on the island. To get them away, Odysseus has to literally drag them to the ships and tie them up. More grief is found in the land of the Cyclopes, a tribe of giant one-eyed herdsmen who live in caves. Trying to steal some of their goats for food, Odysseus's men are trapped in the cave of a Cyclops whose name, as we have learned in Book 1, is Polyphemus. The Cyclops begins eating them 2 at a time. Odysseus plans an escape, getting Polyphemus drunk and then driving a sharpened log through his single eye. But Odysseus's warrior arrogance leads him to make a terrible mistake. While he and his other men are escaping on their ships, he shouts to the Cyclops that his real name is Odysseus. Now that Polyphemus knows who has blinded him, he is able to tell his father, the god Poseidon. This is why Poseidon is angry at Odysseus and keeps him away from home for so many years. Zeus is blamed for the storm that drives Odysseus' ships off course. This is not so much because Zeus is angry at the Greeks, but because as the sky god, he is responsible for most storms. As the leader of the Olympian gods, Zeus is also the ultimate authority and judge. But when Odysseus begs for his release in the name of Zeus, the Cyclops is so savage that he doesn't recognize the god's authority. It is possible that the Cyclopes were a portrayal of some tribal people the Greeks came across in their travels. Usually, though, giants in traditional folklore represent humanity itself in its lowest state. The rough Cyclopes are a typical giant race. They know how to herd animals, but they don't farm, and they don't have laws or any other marks of culture. Naturally, these savages also eat human beings. Some scholars think the Lotus Eaters might have been a people from the north coast of Africa, possibly near Egypt. The fruit they live on may be the fruit of the lotus tree, whose flower was thought to have sacred significance and was used in Egyptian funerals. The Greeks were in general disapproving of drunkenness or any other form of intoxication. They even drank their wine mixed with water. The practices of the Lotus Eaters may convey the Greeks' opinion of cultures that used recreational drugs. There are several cases where it is Odysseus's men who get them into trouble, but it is Odysseus himself whose idea it was to go to the cave of the Cyclops, and Odysseus who lets the Cyclops know who blinded him. With the blinding of Polyphemus, the son of the god Poseidon, we learn the details of the incident that angered the sea god and made Odysseus the last of the Greek kings to reach home. The episode is also one of the most famous of Odysseus's tricks. When first asked his name by Polyphemus, Odysseus tells him that his name is Nobody. So when blinded, Polyphemus is shouting for help from his neighbors. They say, "Who is hurting you?" And he can only reply, "Nobody is hurting me." They shout back that if nobody is hurting him, they needn't come to help. In Greek, there are two forms of the word for nobody. One of the words has a second meaning of clever. So for Greek audiences, the name would have been a pun, reminding them of Odysseus's most famous characteristic. Question 1. Any of Odysseus's men who eat the sweet-smelling fruit of the lotus change form, become gods, forget everything, die. Any of Odysseus's men who eat the sweet-smelling fruit of the lotus forget everything, wanting only to remain on the island. Question 2. In traditional folklore, what do giants represent? Humanity itself in its highest state, an absence of God, humanity itself in its lowest state, strength and wisdom. In traditional folklore, giants represent humanity itself in its lowest state. Question 3. What does Odysseus first tell Polyphemus his name is? Zeus, nobody, fortitude, Poseidon. Odysseus first tells Polyphemus that his name is nobody. So when the blinded Polyphemus is shouting for help from his neighbors, they say, "Who is hurting you?" And he can only reply, "Nobody is hurting me." In Book 10, Odysseus tells of his visits to the island of Aeolus, who rules the winds, the land of the cannibal Laestrygonians, and the island of Circe, who is both a goddess and a sorcerer. After escaping from the Cyclopes, Odysseus and his 12 ships come to the island of Aeolus, ruler of the winds. When the Ithacans leave, Aeolus gives Odysseus a leather bag filled with all the winds except the ones the men need to get home. But Odysseus's men think the bag is filled with treasure. The ship is within sight of Ithaca itself when the men open the bag, and the winds blow them all the way back to where they started. Next, the ships land at the island of the Laestrygonians, giant cannibals who throw huge rocks at Odysseus's ships. 11 of the 12 ships are smashed, and the men are killed and eaten. The single surviving ship sails until the Ithacans come to another island. This turns out to be Aea, the home of a sorceress named Circe, who turns men on a scouting expedition into pigs. The god Hermes gives Odysseus an antidote to the goddess's potions and tells him he can force her to release his men by rushing her with a sword so that she will beg mercy from him. Circe and Odysseus become lovers, and she promises not to harm him or his men. The Ithacans stay on Aea for a year until the men finally persuade Odysseus to leave. But Circe has some surprising news for Odysseus. Before they can sail for home, he and his men must visit Hades, the land of the dead, so that Odysseus may speak with the dead prophet Tiresias. Circe gives Odysseus detailed instructions on how to reach Hades and how they are to survive their visit there. Before they can leave, though, one of his men, Elpenor, is killed in an accidental fall from the roof of Circe's palace. When Odysseus and his men are blown back to the island of Aeolus, the ruler of the winds refuses to help them a second time. He reasons that the gods must hate Odysseus, and Aeolus does not dare go against their will. Throughout the Odyssey, human beings are referred to as eaters of bread. This is one of their distinguishing characteristics, just as the gods eat a special food called ambrosia. As cannibals, the Cyclopes and the Laestrygonians disqualify themselves from being fully human. The home of the Laestrygonians has sometimes been identified as the island of Sicily. In later history, the Greeks would have trading colonies in Sicily, but in early times they thought it a strange and foreign place. It is common for traditional societies to believe that the mysterious people just over the horizon are ferocious cannibals. The Odyssey has influenced the traditions of many cultures. The voyages of Sinbad, for instance, includes adventures that come straight from the voyages of Odysseus. It is also believed that Gulliver's encounter with the land of giants in Jonathan Swift's novel Gulliver's Travels was influenced by the encounters that Odysseus and his men have with giants. What Circe does to Odysseus's men is especially horrible. She turns them into pigs, but they retain the minds of human beings so that they are fully aware of what has happened to them. Circe promises under threat of death not to harm Odysseus or his men, and this promise is considered binding. It is a common device in traditional narratives and probably reflects real-life practice. Odysseus also binds Circe to him by having sex with her, but she binds him to herself as well. Despite his longing for home and for his wife Penelope, Odysseus stays with Circe for a whole year and only leaves because his men talk him into it. He also tells the Phaeacians that he would stay with them an extra year if he could return home with many gifts. This willingness to stay away from home should not be taken too seriously, although it does show the conflicting values of the ancient Greeks. For the most part, we are meant to see Odysseus as genuinely desperate to get home. Question 1. Aeolus gives Odysseus a leather bag filled with treasure, the eye of Polyphemus, wind, rain. Aeolus gives Odysseus a leather bag filled with all the winds except the ones the men need to get home. Question 2. Aeolus, ruler of the winds, refuses to help Odysseus a second time. He reasons that Odysseus did not appreciate him. The gods must hate Odysseus. Odysseus does not need his help. Odysseus does not love Penelope. Aeolus, ruler of the winds, refuses to help Odysseus a second time. He reasons that the gods must hate Odysseus, and Aeolus does not dare go against their will. Question 3. Despite his longing for home and for his wife Penelope, Odysseus stays with Circe for a whole year, and only leaves because Zeus sends a terrible storm. Athena casts a spell on him. His men talk him into it. He thirsts for more treasure. Despite his longing for home and for his wife Penelope, Odysseus stays with Circe for a whole year and only leaves because his men talk him into it. In Book 11, Odysseus and his men visit the land of the dead. When the Ithacans enter Hades, they dig a trench in the earth and perform the sacrifices as instructed by Circe. The sacrificial blood runs into the trench, and the souls of the dead come crowding around, jabbering senselessly. Only when they drink from the blood do they become fully aware and able to communicate with Odysseus. Elpenor comes first, and because he has died so recently, he doesn't need to drink the blood to speak. He only wants to be sure that he gets the proper funeral rites before Odysseus and his men leave Circe's island. The prophet Tiresias tells Odysseus that in order to get home in one piece, he and his men must avoid harming the cattle of the sun god. The prophet also says that once Odysseus reaches home, he must make a journey of penitence to placate the wrath of Poseidon before he can settle in Ithaca and live to a ripe old age. After speaking with Tiresias, the reason for this journey to Hades, Odysseus is able to speak to the souls of other dead people, from his mother to ancient figures from the dawn of history. He also speaks with some of the dead heroes of Troy. Agamemnon gives a first-hand account of his own murder and warns Odysseus against faithless wives. The next hero to speak is Achilles. In one of the most famous passages of world literature, Odysseus tries to comfort Achilles for his early death by telling him how his deeds continue to live in memory. Achilles replies that he would rather be the lowliest of men and be alive than to be a ruler among the dead. Odysseus wants to stay longer. He's curious to meet more dead celebrities, and he would like to make up an old feud with the dead hero Ajax. but the thronging ghosts begin to frighten him, and he fears that he might meet some monster sent up from hell. He tells his men that it's time to go. Book 11 is one of the most famous and important sections of the Odyssey, Odysseus' visit to the land of the dead. In Greek tradition, such a story is called a naquia, from the Greek word for death. In Greek and Roman literature, there is a whole genre of naquia stories. The visit to the underworld is like a special ritual. Before the hero can achieve his goal, he must symbolically die and be reborn. Lasting fame after death is very important to these warrior kings. Achilles is said to have chosen to die young, with his fame living forever, rather than die old and unknown. But the ancient Greeks had normal human fears as well as heroic warrior values. Now that he is dead, Achilles values life more highly than fame. The line in which he says he would rather be unknown but alive rather than king of the dead is very famous. It influenced the English poet John Milton many hundreds of years later, when he had the fallen angel Lucifer say the opposite, that he would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. Question 1. When the Ithacans enter Hades, they dig a trench in the earth and prepare for battle, perform sacrifices, bury their fallen comrades, bury their remaining treasure. When the Ithacans enter Hades, they dig a trench in the earth and perform the sacrifices as instructed by Circe. Question 2. The visit to the underworld is like a special ritual. Before the hero can achieve his goal, he must symbolically die and be reborn, cross the river Styx, prove his bravery to the gods, make peace with the dead. The visit to the underworld is like a special ritual. Before the hero can achieve his goal, he must symbolically die and be reborn. Question 3. Agamemnon gives a first-hand account of his own murder and warns Odysseus against his own men, Aeolus, faithless wives, Poseidon. Agamemnon gives a first-hand account of his own murder and warns Odysseus against faithless wives.